up, guys? This is Setsme, and I'm coming to you with a brand new episode of Deck Building 101. This week, I wanted to talk about preference versus meta choices. And this does have somewhat to do with, this is really more to do with Tier 2 decks than it really does with Tier 1. Tier 1 decks typically have a set formula that is generally agreed by a large amount of people. Shaddolls, for example, had a line, usually you would see a lineup of 10 Shaddolls. Um, I was not a Shaddol player, so I don't remember it offhand, but it was generally agreed that a certain formula of cards for those tier 1 decks was the right decision. Now, in this new meta, there has been some changes in terms of like what card the certain number of cards, such as Cosmo Dark Destroyer. Some people prefer three, some don't. I personally don't prefer three just because three level 8 monsters that into normal and then special into, yeah, you can make the argument that Forerunner was similar, but it's a better card to cycle, but it's not a great card to constantly draw. So that's my personal opinion over the card. Do not judge, whatever. But I'll get to why like three of Doctor. There's a good case for three versus a good case for maybe one or two. So we'll get to that later. And a lot of the preference versus meta really has to do with what cards you have in your deck, what type of deck you're playing, and what your pure goal is. Now, a good example of preference versus meta is the Mystic Tomato heroes that made top 8 Worlds this past year. Nobody was expecting cards like, I believe it was Kinetic Warrior and Mystic Tomato, just simply because the cards were just so old, one. Two, heroes were way more popular in Japan than they were in the TCG, in terms of like how good they were. It didn't help them that Roto was at 1 over an OCG, but um, the thing was, the guy made a meta call and a preference call. His preference was to OTK Special Summon Darklaw as fast as humanly possible versus a more grindier version of the deck that really let you search out as many cards as possible. The guy proved that the deck could be somewhat OTK centric. It could be more along the lines of being speedier and really disrupting your opponent. And that's why he was so successful, is because he preferred a different method than what people were used to seeing from heroes. Now, obviously, there are cards, as I said before, that come down to preference. A great triple example is Fairy Wind versus Anti-Spell Fragrance versus Spell Shattering Arrow. Each of these cards basically has the same use in the meta today. They have their main goal is to prevent cards like decks that really focus on pendulums from really doing their thing. Anti-Spell Fragrance is particularly popular in Teller Knights right now, just simply because Teller Knights are, while they are one of the best decks at the moment, they can't. It's hard for them to compete against decks like Cosmos and um and Magispecters. While Cosmos may not necessarily completely rely on spell cards, they're an essential part to the deck, such as E-Telly and Cosmotown. Um, to the point where anti-spell fragrance would be pretty disruptible if they so happen to draw into a copy or two of either one of the cards. Fairy Wind and Spell Shattering Arrow, on the other hand, are more tech choices for decks that really rely on spell cards. A good example of this is Heroes or UAs. UAs I'm just bringing up as an example because that's one of my favorite decks, but I would not play Anti-Spell Fragrance in either of these decks simply because both of the decks rely so heavily on spells. Teller Knights don't. They rely on a heavy trap back row, and that's why they use this card. They don't use a lot of spells. Fairy Wind and Spell Shattering Arrow do two different things. Spell Shattering Arrow just destroys spell cards. Now, this can be very useful, specifically against pendulums again. There aren't a lot of continuous spell cards, but this card actually may go up in price when we see Monarchs hit the TCGs, just simply because Monarchs rely heavily on continuous and field spells. Fairy Wind, on the other hand, covers a lot of bases in the fact that it can get rid of floodgates such as Anti-Spell Fragrance or uh, Skill Drain, Mind Drain, Vanity's Emptiness, cards like that that are really hard to overcome. Plus, it's a trap card, so Anti-Spell Fragrance doesn't prevent this, and both of them do damage. Arguably, and typically Spell Shattering Arrow will do more, but Fairy Wind is, from what I've seen, is the preferred option between the two. Another interesting card that is becoming more and more obvious in terms of its popularity, and not only its offensive powers in pendulum decks, but also its defensive powers against pendulum decks, is actually Wavering Eyes. If you're a pendulum player and you're playing and you have Wavering Eyes in your deck, and if you're playing Draco Perform Mages or something of the like, Wavering Eyes is very useful, especially if you're going up against a mirror match or another pendulum deck, because if your opponent has a complete scale and you set your scale, you can activate Spell Shattering Arrow, you'll get the search, and your opponent will get nothing from it. It's even very useful against your opponent. When they have the set scale, they're about to pendulum summon, you activate Spell Shattering Arrow, you deal 1,000 damage to them, and they don't get a search. You do if you're playing a pendulum deck. So that's another interesting card to play. However, it's a little bit more specific in terms of what cards it can hit, versus these three cards where it's very general. Moving on, Mind Crush versus Mistake. Now, this is a very common um, debate on which card is technically better, and really depends on the deck. Mistake is really good for decks that don't search and add to hand. Decks that really utilize this are, let's see here. The big one, obviously, being Yang Zings. Yang Zings special summon directly from deck. They don't search at all. This card can be very useful for them because it really slows down their opponents. I have seen Infernoid builds with this because, yes, while they do search to a degree, most of the time they're just sending to the graveyard and special summoning off of that. Mind Drain is for decks that do search. Not Mind Drain, Mind Crush. Because, one, it allows you to really capitalize on the fact that they are searching, prevents them from using any of those cards that they search, and copies of it in their hand, and you get to look at their hand. Mistake doesn't let you do that. So there are benefits to both, and there are detriments to both. It just depends on the deck that you're playing. Arguably, Mind Crush is the better card, however. Moving on. Cosmo, anyway, so we're going to go back to preference versus meta. Preference has more to do with what cards do you want to see the most in your deck, and how often, and how useful you feel they are towards your end goal, which is winning. What's your win condition? How do you want to accomplish that win condition? And is it the win condition that you feel comfortable with going? Because if you don't feel comfortable with going in a certain win condition, and it's something that you don't quite understand, or you don't feel like you personally can pull off 100% of the time, or the majority of the time at the very least, that's not the deck. That's not the deck for you, or it's not the strategy for you. That's why I personally play around with different types of decks to find the deck that I prefer. Lightsworn Perform Mages is probably my personal favorite of of Perform Mages that I ever did, just simply because it was fun, it was consistent for what I wanted to do, and it was the deck that I felt comfortable playing. Currently I am playing Cosmos in an online tournament, and there are a lot of Cosmos in the tournament. I believe it's at least 70% of the tournament is actually Cosmos, and oddly enough, I've only had 2 mirror matches, I believe, and out of 3 matches I've played. One of those mirror matches I lost, the other one I did win. So Cosmo Dark Destroyer, I play one of it in the deck. Mind you, this deck, because of the fact that the Cosmos were just released at the start of the tournament, in terms of we knew what they were doing, and it was very hard to test Cosmos in general, just because of the way that Dueling Network works, and the Yu-Gi Pro that I am currently, the version of Yu-Gi Pro that I am using, I could not test the deck, which is something that I don't recommend. It causes a lot of pain when you're dueling, because certain things aren't working out the way you want them to. But I chose to go with one Dark Destroyer, and my reasoning behind that, I will show this deck profile to you guys at some point in the future. But the reasoning why that I want to go with one Dark Destroyer is because I didn't like the loop that it created. I felt that it was a little gimmicky, and it didn't quite accomplish what I wanted to do. I felt more comfortable with one Dark Destroyer because it's a very useful card, and you can always cycle it back to your hand with Cosmo down. That being said, Dark Destroyer I wish sometimes I had more of, just simply because it is an extremely good card. Its price is evident of that. But there are a lot of decks of people who are way more used to the Cosmo archetype than I am, that use 3 of it, mainly because there's a huge cycle you can constantly do with Dark Destroyer, where you destroy himself, special something else, etc., etc. So that is just comes down to personal preference and what you want to do. The next one, another common personal preference versus meta is Hat Tricker and Trick Clown. Now, when we first learned of the Perform Mage archetype, Trick Clown was undoubtedly the best card. That was when we still had Lavalval Chain. That was when we could spam Norden online and like all of that. However, we don't have Exton anymore. We don't have Lavalval Chain anymore, and those were both two very good cards for the for that particular engine. Now, because that engine isn't as good as it was when it was in the OCG, people are preferring Hat Trigger just simply because of its special summon effect and the fact that it actually requires monsters on the field in general in order for it to be special summoned. Plus, it also has OTK potential in the fact that its attack can become 3,300. It's ridiculous. I've done it once or twice, and it's really funny when suddenly you have a 3,300 beater on the field that your opponent can't really deal with. Does that happen often? No, but it's still an interesting effect for that in general. So in some ways, in a lot of ways, Hat Tricker is usually the preferred card, just simply because people aren't willing to use life points as much. There are a lot of the top 3 decks OTK pretty easily right now. Those top 3, I would personally say, are well, top 4. I'll say top 4. Cosmos being number 1. Magispectors, Infernoids, and Tellarknights, not necessarily in that order, but those are definitely the top 4 decks at the moment, in my opinion. If they were to run Trick Clown, and I've seen 1 or 2 Infernoid builds that do run Trick Clown. Tellarknights in general don't do it because they don't really need to. Cosmo doesn't do it at all, and Magispectors would be stupid too, mainly just because of the way the deck runs. But they don't really want to risk life points in order to like get out rank 4s. Hat Trigger doesn't require any life points to summon, and in fact, if you use it in combination with Trick Clown, you don't have to take damage if you don't want to. Finally, Hat Trigger lets you get out cards such as Naturi Beast. If you combo with Global, which is very popular in any Clownblade engine, Hat Trigger becomes an instant Naturi Beast, and your opponent has a very difficult time dealing with spells. As we've seen, spells are becoming much more and more of a higher count in terms of your deck as the power creep continues. Traps are becoming more and more slow in comparison to what is coming out at the moment. So spell cards are becoming more and more important in the game, and like they were important obviously before they're a main mechanic of the game, but the fact that Naturi Beast is so underrated in terms of like how useful it can be in the meta right now is pretty insane. And like I'm not saying that it is underrated, it's just not as used as it probably should be right now in my again in my opinion. But however, so going back to preference versus meta, preference really comes down to what you want to see, what you want to do, what's your end goal. My UA deck profile, which is UAs are my favorite archetype, I prefer to constantly rely on Slugger and Ace and cycling between the two, just simply because Ace is a fantastic card and Slugger means you get a free attack. I like that certainty of being able to negate something that my opponent wants to do and really disrupt them, and then being able to attack them for a minimum of 2,300 attacks straight to the face. And that's my main point of the deck. That's what I want to see all the time. And the way that I run the deck, for me, I see it as consistent enough to the point where I feel comfortable with the deck where it's at. So that's my personal thing in terms of that. There are other ways that you can manipulate preference in terms of side deck, extra deck. Those are very common ways to do that. There's also other cards you can sub in determining what deck you have. Another example is MST versus Galaxy Cyclone, but again, that's another topic for another day. So that concludes this episode of Deck Building 101. Thank you guys for watching as always, and of course, have a nice day.